In 1720, the Dutch florin was the world's reserve currency. Every major trade contract was denominated in florins. Every central bank held Dutch bonds. Amsterdam was the financial center of the world. The florin was considered eternal, backed by the wealthiest trading empire in history. Within 50 years, the florin was irrelevant, replaced by a new reserve currency that would dominate for the next century. In 1900, the British pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. The sun never set on British territory. Every commodity was priced in pounds. Every nation held sterling reserves. London was the financial capital of the planet. The pound was considered permanent, backed by the largest empire in human history. Within 45 years, the pound collapsed, replaced by a new reserve currency that would dominate the post-war world. In 2025, the United States dollar is the world's reserve currency. Approximately 59% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. Oil is priced in dollars. International trade is conducted in dollars. The Federal Reserve is the de facto central bank of the world. The dollar is considered irreplaceable, backed by the largest economy and the most powerful military in history. But history has a pattern, and that pattern says the dollar's dominance is ending, not someday, now. Because every reserve currency in the last 500 years has followed the same 7-stage cycle from dominance to collapse. The Dutch florin completed all 7 stages. The pound sterling completed all 7 stages. The French franc, the Spanish real, they all followed the same sequence. And the United States dollar has already completed 5 of the 7 stages. This isn't speculation about the distant future. This is pattern recognition based on documented historical cycles. When you see how reserve currencies actually die, when you understand the specific sequence of events that precedes collapse, you'll recognize that the dollar is following the exact same path. The timeline is predictable, the stages are measurable. And we're running out of time. Let me show you the 5 reserve currencies that dominated global trade and then collapsed, the 7-stage death cycle they all followed, why the dollar has already moved through 5 of those stages, and what stages 6 and 7 look like when they arrive. Because understanding this pattern is understanding the next 20 years of your financial life. Before we examine the specific currencies, you need to understand what a reserve currency actually is and why it matters. A reserve currency is the currency that other nations hold in their central bank reserves and use to conduct international trade. When countries trade with each other, they don't exchange their own currencies directly. They use a reserve currency as the intermediary. If Japan wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they don't trade yen for reals. They both use dollars. Japan converts yen to dollars, pays Saudi Arabia in dollars. Saudi Arabia either keeps the dollars or converts them to rials. The dollar is the medium of exchange that makes global trade function. This gives the reserve currency issuer enormous advantages. First, the issuing country can print money, and other nations must accept it because they need it for trade. Second, the issuing country can borrow cheaply because other nations buy their bonds to hold as reserves. Third, the issuing country controls the rules of the global financial system. If you want to trade internationally, you play by their rules. These advantages are so powerful that reserve currency status is the foundation of empire. Britain ruled the world not primarily through military conquest, but through financial dominance. The pound was required for global trade, which meant everyone needed to hold British assets, which meant Britain could finance its empire by printing money that other nations had to accept. But reserve currency status is not permanent, it's a cycle. Every reserve currency in history has eventually collapsed and been replaced. The cycle follows 7 predictable stages, and once a currency enters the later stages, collapse becomes inevitable regardless of what policymakers try to do. The Dutch florin dominated from roughly 1,650 to 1,720. The pound sterling dominated from 1,815 to 1,944. The dollar has dominated since 1944. That's 81 years, and history suggests that's approaching the end of the cycle. Let's start with the Dutch florin and trace exactly how a reserve currency dies. In the mid-1600s, the Dutch Republic was the wealthiest nation in Europe. Amsterdam was the financial center of the world. The Dutch East India Company was the largest corporation in history, worth roughly $7 trillion in today's dollars. Dutch ships dominated global trade. The florin was the currency everyone wanted to hold because the Dutch economy was the most dynamic and innovative in the world. Stage 1 of the reserve currency cycle is economic dominance. The currency becomes the reserve because the issuing country has the largest, most productive economy. Trade naturally flows through their currency because they're the biggest buyer and seller of goods. The Dutch achieved this through merchant capitalism, shipbuilding, and trade networks spanning Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Stage 2 is financial infrastructure. The reserve currency issuer builds the institutions that make global finance function. The Dutch created the first modern stock exchange, the first central bank, sophisticated insurance markets, and the financial instruments that allowed international trade to operate efficiently. Other nations used these Dutch institutions because they were simply better than anything else available. Stage 3 is military security. Reserve currency status requires military power to protect trade routes and enforce contracts. The Dutch Navy was the most powerful in the world during their dominance. They could protect merchant ships, blockade rivals, and project power globally. This military capacity made the florin safe because it was backed by force. Stage 4 is overextension. This is where the cycle begins to turn negative. The reserve currency issuer starts spending beyond their productive capacity. For the Dutch, this came through constant warfare. The Anglo-Dutch wars against England, wars against France, wars against Spain. Military spending consumed an increasing share of Dutch resources. The economy was still wealthy, but the costs of maintaining dominance were rising faster than the economy could grow. Stage 5 is financial speculation and debt accumulation. As productive growth slows, the economy shifts toward financial speculation. The Dutch experienced this in the 1,630 seconds with tulip mania, the first recorded financial bubble in history. Tulip bulbs were traded for prices exceeding annual incomes. When the bubble collapsed, it damaged the real economy. The Dutch government also accumulated debt financing wars. Debt service began consuming resources that should have gone to productive investment. Stage 6 is loss of competitive advantage. Other nations begin catching up economically and developing their own financial infrastructure. By the early 1700s, England and France had built economies that rivaled the Dutch. London was developing financial markets that competed with Amsterdam. The Dutch advantage in shipbuilding and trade was eroding as other nations copied their methods. Stage 7 is displacement. A new reserve currency emerges, and international trade shifts away from the old currency. For the Dutch, this happened gradually through the 1700s as the pound sterling began replacing the florin in international trade. By 1780, London had replaced Amsterdam as the financial center of the world. The florin didn't disappear overnight, but its role as the dominant reserve currency ended. The Dutch remained wealthy, but they were no longer the center of global finance. The cycle had completed. The British pound followed the exact same pattern, just on a larger scale and over a longer time frame. By 1815, after defeating Napoleon, Britain was the dominant global power. The pound sterling was backed by the largest empire in human history. Britain controlled trade routes, dominated manufacturing, and operated the most sophisticated financial system in the world. Stage 1: Economic dominance. Britain was the workshop of the world in the 1800s. The Industrial Revolution started in Britain and gave them massive advantages in manufacturing. British goods were cheaper and better than anyone else's. Global trade naturally flowed through London because Britain was the largest trading nation. Stage 2: Financial infrastructure. Britain created the modern international financial system. The Bank of England operated as a proto-central bank for global finance. London's capital markets were the deepest and most liquid in the world. The gold standard, which pegged currencies to gold, was managed by Britain and gave the pound credibility. If you wanted to conduct international finance, you used British institutions because nothing else was comparable. Stage 3. Military security. The British Navy was the largest in the world throughout the 1800s. Britannia ruled the waves, and that naval dominance protected trade routes and enforced contracts. The pound was safe because British military power backed it. Stage 4. Overextension. By the late 1800s, Britain was spending enormous sums to maintain the empire. Military bases on 6 continents, colonial administrations, constant small wars to maintain control. The costs of empire were rising, while Britain's economic growth was slowing as other nations industrialized. Then came World War I. The war cost Britain over $40 billion, roughly $1 trillion in today's money. Britain borrowed heavily from the United States to finance the war. The creditor had become the debtor. Stage 5. Financial speculation and debt accumulation. After World War I, Britain tried to maintain the pound's pre-war value by returning to the gold standard at the old rate. This required keeping interest rates high, which strangled economic growth. Meanwhile, financial speculation in London increased as productive investment declined. Britain was trying to maintain financial dominance even as the real economy weakened. Stage 6. Loss of competitive advantage. By the 1920s, the United States had become the world's largest economy. American manufacturing exceeded British production. New York's financial markets were growing to rival London. Britain still had the empire and the institutions, but the economic foundation was crumbling. Then World War II finished the process. The war cost Britain another $120 billion. By 1945, Britain owed the United States and Canada more than Britain's entire GDP. The empire was bankrupt. Stage 7. Displacement. In 1944, while the war was still ongoing, representatives from 44 nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the post-war financial system. The pound was finished. Everyone knew it. The dollar became the new reserve currency, backed by American economic dominance and gold reserves. Britain tried to maintain the fiction of pound supremacy for another 20 years, but by 1967 the pound had to be devalued. The cycle was complete. The currency that had dominated for over a century was replaced. Now let's examine where the United States dollar sits in this cycle and why the evidence suggests we're in the late stages. Stage 1. Economic dominance. The United States achieved this coming out of World War II. America held roughly 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. The U.S. economy was larger than the next several economies combined. American manufacturing was unmatched. The dollar became the reserve currency at Bretton Woods in 1944 because the U.S. was the undisputed economic superpower. This stage lasted roughly from 1944 to 1971. Stage 2. Financial infrastructure. The United States built the institutions that run global finance. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, both headquartered in Washington and dominated by the U.S. The SWIFT system for international payments, controlled by Western institutions, aligned with the U.S. The petrodollar system, where oil is priced in dollars, created through agreements with Saudi Arabia in the 1970 seconds. If you want to participate in global finance, you use American-dominated institutions. This infrastructure was built from the 1940 seconds through the 1970 seconds and remains in place today. Stage 3. Military security. The United States maintains the most powerful military in history. Over 700 military bases in more than 80 countries, a navy that can project power globally, nuclear weapons that guarantee security. This military dominance backs the dollar's status as reserve currency. Nations trust the dollar, partly because American military power protects the system. This stage remains in effect, though the costs are enormous. Stage 4, Overextension. This is where the United States clearly entered the danger zone. American military spending exceeds the next 10 countries combined, over $800 billion annually, not counting wars and black budget programs. Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost over $6 trillion, according to Brown University's estimates. Military commitments to defend NATO, Japan, South Korea, and other allies stretch resources thin. The empire is expensive, and the costs keep rising. Meanwhile, the productive economy is hollowing out. Manufacturing has moved to China and other nations. The trade deficit exceeds $800 billion annually, meaning America imports far more than it exports. The economy is increasingly financialized rather than productive. This is classic Stage 4, where maintaining dominance becomes more expensive than the economy can sustain. Stage 5, Financial speculation and debt accumulation. This is where America clearly sits in 2025. Federal debt exceeds $36 trillion, roughly 122% of GDP. The debt has doubled in the last 15 years. Annual deficits exceed $1 trillion even during economic growth. Interest payments on the debt now exceed $1.2 trillion per year, making debt service the largest line item in the federal budget. This is unsustainable mathematics. The debt compounds while growth slows. Meanwhile, financial speculation has replaced productive investment across the economy. Stock buybacks exceed research and development spending at most corporations. Real estate and financial assets inflate, while productive capacity stagnates. Private equity firms buy companies, load them with debt, extract fees, and leave the companies to collapse. This is late-stage financialization, where money makes money through speculation rather than production. The critical signs that America is in Stage 5 are everywhere. The savings rate has collapsed. Americans save roughly 3% of income compared to 10% or more in the 1,970 seconds. Household debt exceeds $14 trillion. Consumer spending is sustained by borrowing rather than income growth. Corporate debt has exploded from $2 trillion in 2008 to over $11 trillion today. Much of this debt was used not for productive investment, but to buy back stocks and inflate executive compensation. Government debt grows exponentially with no plan to ever reduce it. The entire system is built on ever-increasing debt, which is the hallmark of Stage 5 in the reserve currency death cycle. Stage 6 is loss of competitive advantage, and this is forming now. China's economy is approaching U.S. size using purchasing power parity measures. China is the world's largest manufacturer, largest exporter, largest trading partner for most nations. China graduates more engineers than the U.S. graduates students. China's infrastructure investment dwarfs American investment. High-speed rail, 5G networks, port facilities, all exceed American capabilities. The competitive advantage America had in 1945 or even 2000 has eroded substantially. The dollar remains dominant, but the economic foundation supporting that dominance is weakening. Other nations are also building alternative financial infrastructure. China's CIPS payment system offers an alternative to SWIFT. The BRICS nations are developing mechanisms to trade in local currencies rather than dollars. These are still small compared to the dollar system, but they're growing. This is how Stage 6 begins, not with sudden replacement, but with gradual development of alternatives. The most significant evidence of Stage 6 is the weaponization of dollar dominance and the reaction it's causing. In 2022, the United States and European allies froze roughly $300 billion in Russian foreign exchange reserves held in Western banks. This was unprecedented. For decades, foreign reserves held in dollars were considered sacrosanct. Freezing them sent shockwaves through every central bank in the world. If Russia's reserves could be frozen for political reasons, anyone's reserves could be frozen. This single action accelerated the global movement away from dollar dependence. China began reducing treasury holdings. Saudi Arabia started accepting yuan for oil sales. Central banks accelerated gold purchases to record levels. Over 1,000 tons of gold purchased by central banks in 2022, the highest since 1950. This is exactly what happened to the pound. Britain weaponized sterling dominance to pressure nations during the world wars. This created resentment and motivated other nations to develop alternatives. When the U.S. offered a new system at Bretton Woods, nations were ready to switch. The dollar is now in the same position. Nations are developing alternatives not because they hate America, but because they fear dependence on a system that can be weaponized against them. Stage 7 is displacement, and this is what comes next. Displacement doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process where international trade slowly shifts away from the reserve currency. For the pound, displacement took roughly 25 years from 1,944 to the late 1,960 seconds. The dollar's displacement is likely to take a similar time frame, meaning it could be substantially underway by 2035 to 2040. The signs of early displacement are already visible. The share of global reserves held in dollars has declined from 71% in 1999 to 59% in 2024. That's a significant erosion. China and Russia conduct bilateral trade in yuan and rubles, bypassing dollars entirely. Saudi Arabia signed agreements to sell oil to China in yuan, breaking the petrodollar monopoly. The European Union has pushed for euro-denominated energy contracts. India is buying Russian oil in rupees. These are all small steps, but they point in one direction, away from dollar dominance. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are actively working to create alternative payment systems and potentially a BRICS currency for trade settlement. BRICS represents roughly 42% of global population and 36% of global GDP using purchasing power parity. If they succeed in creating a viable alternative to the dollar for trade among member nations, it would represent the largest economic bloc in history operating partially outside dollar hegemony. This doesn't mean the dollar disappears. The pound still exists today. The Dutch florin still exists as part of the euro. But these currencies are no longer reserve currencies. They're regional currencies with limited international role. That's the future of the dollar if the cycle completes. What would Stage 7 displacement actually look like for America? First, the trade deficit becomes unsustainable. Currently, America runs massive trade deficits, importing far more than exporting. Other nations accept this because they need dollars for international trade and to hold as reserves. They accumulate dollars by selling goods to America. If the dollar loses reserve status, other nations don't need to accumulate dollars anymore. They stop accepting large trade deficits. America would be forced to balance trade, meaning a massive reduction in imports. This would cause severe shortages and price spikes for everything from electronics to clothing to pharmaceuticals. Second, the federal government loses the ability to borrow cheaply. Currently, Treasury bonds yield relatively low interest rates because foreign central banks and institutions buy them to hold as reserves. If demand for dollar assets declines, Treasury yields would spike. The federal government would face a choice between defaulting on debt or inflating it away by printing money. Either option destroys wealth on a massive scale. Third, living standards decline sharply. Americans have enjoyed consumption beyond their production for decades because reserve currency status allows deficit spending. Without that privilege, consumption must match production. For most Americans, this means a significant reduction in material living standards. Imports become expensive, goods become scarce. The economy contracts to match its actual productive capacity rather than its inflated financial capacity. Fourth, social and political instability follows economic decline. When living standards drop, populations become angry. They demand solutions from governments. When governments can't deliver because the economic foundation has eroded, political systems become unstable. This is what happened to Britain after World War II. Economic decline led to political upheaval, the collapse of empire, and a fundamental restructuring of British society. America would likely experience something similar. The timeline for Stage 7 is probably 10 to 25 years. The dollar won't collapse next year. Reserve currency displacement is a process, not an event. But the process is underway. Every month, more trade is conducted in non-dollar currencies. Every quarter, central banks buy more gold and fewer treasuries. Every year, alternative payment systems grow more sophisticated. The direction is clear, even if the exact timing isn't. By 2040, the dollar's role will likely be substantially diminished compared to today. By 2050, the dollar might be a regional currency, like the pound is now, still used domestically and for some trade, but no longer the dominant reserve currency. The question is, what replaces the dollar? History suggests the replacement is the currency of the next dominant economic power. After the florin came the pound, because Britain became the economic superpower. After the pound came the dollar, because America became the economic superpower. Logic suggests the yuan becomes the next reserve currency because China is the rising economic power. But there are complications. The yuan is not freely convertible. China maintains capital controls that prevent free flow of money in and out of the country. Reserve currencies require deep, liquid financial markets where anyone can buy and sell large amounts of assets. China's financial markets are not yet at that level of sophistication. More likely, the world moves to a multipolar currency system where no single currency dominates. Trade might be conducted in a basket of currencies: yuan, euro, dollar, rupee, with the specific mix depending on the countries involved. Some economists propose creating a new international currency not tied to any single nation, similar to the IMF's special drawing rights, but with broader usage. Digital currencies might play a role, either central bank digital currencies or potentially private cryptocurrencies, though the latter seems unlikely for large-scale international trade. The transition away from dollar dominance will be messy and chaotic because there's no obvious replacement ready to take over. This chaos is another reason why displacement causes economic pain. Uncertainty about the future monetary system freezes investment and trade, causing economic contraction even before the displacement is complete. For individual Americans, understanding this cycle is crucial for financial planning. If the dollar loses reserve status over the next 20 years, several things become probable. First, inflation will be higher and more persistent than the last 50 years. As foreign demand for dollars declines, the dollars that have been held overseas will flow back to America. This increases the domestic money supply, causing inflation. Simultaneously, the federal government will likely print money to finance deficits that can no longer be financed through borrowing. More money chasing the same goods means higher prices. Second, real assets will outperform financial assets. Stocks and bonds are claims on future cash flows denominated in dollars. If the dollar's value erodes, those claims become worth less. Real assets like property, commodities, precious metals, productive businesses, these maintain value because they're not dependent on dollar stability. Third, international diversification becomes essential. Holding assets only in dollars and only in America becomes much riskier when dollar dominance ends. Diversifying into other currencies, foreign assets, and international investments provides protection against dollar decline. Fourth, skills and productivity become more valuable than credentials. In a declining economy, what you can actually do matters more than degrees or titles. Practical skills that produce tangible value, engineering, medicine, trades, agriculture, become highly valuable. Finally, debt becomes extremely dangerous. If inflation accelerates and the economy contracts simultaneously, servicing debt becomes very difficult. Fixed-rate debt might be inflated away, which benefits borrowers. But variable-rate debt becomes crushing as interest rates spike. The safest position is minimal debt and maximum flexibility. The reserve currency death cycle has played out 5 times in modern history. The Spanish real dominated in the 1500s and collapsed by 1650. The Dutch florin dominated from 1650 to 1720. The French franc had a brief period of prominence from 1720 to 1815. The British pound dominated from 1815 to 1944. The U.S. dollar has dominated since 1944. Each cycle lasted roughly 70 to 130 years. Each followed the same 7 stages, from economic dominance to displacement. And each time, the holders of the old reserve currency believed their dominance was permanent, right up until it ended. Americans in 2025 believe the dollar is irreplaceable. They point to the depth of U.S. financial markets, the strength of American institutions, the power of the U.S. military. These are the same arguments British economists made about the pound in 1920. They were wrong. The economic fundamentals matter more than institutional inertia. When debt becomes unsustainable, when productive capacity erodes, when competitive advantage disappears, reserve currency status ends regardless of military power or historical precedent. The cycle doesn't care about exceptionalism. It runs on mathematics. The United States has completed 5 of the 7 stages in the reserve currency death cycle. Economic dominance, check. Financial infrastructure, check. Military security, check, though increasingly expensive. Overextension, clearly in progress. Financial speculation and debt accumulation, deeply entrenched. Loss of competitive advantage, forming now as China rises and alternatives develop. Displacement, beginning as trade slowly shifts away from dollars. Stages 6 and 7 are underway. The question isn't whether the dollar loses reserve status. History says that's inevitable. The question is timing and how painful the transition will be. Maybe American policymakers will manage the transition skillfully, reducing debt, rebuilding productive capacity, and negotiating a gradual shift to a multipolar currency system. Maybe the decline will be managed and relatively orderly. Or maybe it will be chaotic, marked by financial crisis, social upheaval, and political instability like Britain experienced from 1945 to 1970. History suggests the latter is more likely because nations don't voluntarily give up the privileges of reserve currency status. They cling to dominance until reality forces adjustment. And by then, the adjustment is painful. The reserve currency death cycle has destroyed 5 currencies. The Spanish real, the Dutch florin, the French franc, the British pound, all once considered eternal and irreplaceable. All followed the same 7 stages. All eventually displaced by a new reserve currency backed by a new dominant economy. The U.S. dollar is following the same path. We're in stage 5, possibly entering stage 6. Stage 7, displacement, is coming. Not tomorrow, but within the next 2 decades. Understanding this pattern isn't pessimism, it's pattern recognition based on 500 years of documented history. The cycle exists, it's real. And the dollar is not exempt. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, it's rhyming with 1,920 seconds. Britain, 1,710 seconds. Amsterdam, and every other reserve currency in the final stages before displacement. The question isn't whether it happens. The question is what you do with this knowledge while there's still time to prepare.